He came home on a Tuesday afternoon expecting silence, maybe a cup of coffee and a quiet evening. But instead he found a massacre. His front hedges, 12 feet tall, perfectly trimmed, planted by his father 23 years ago, were shaved down to ugly stumps, butchered into a jagged, uneven line that exposed his entire living room window to the street. A bright orange HOA notice flapped in the wind like a victory flag. Mandated trimming FOR community view enhancement. And standing across the street, arms folded, sunglasses reflecting his confusion back at him, was Karen, the HOA president, smiling like she'd solved a problem. He felt heat crawl up his spine, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that becomes a promise, because she hadn't just cut plants. She'd cut privacy, history, boundaries. She'd vandalized something alive and called it improvement. When he asked her why she didn't notify him, she only shrugged and said, "The community deserves a better view. Consider it a favor." Favor. That word echoed through his skull until it felt like a command. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He just looked at the butchered hedges, looked at her smile, looked at the empty space where his peace used to be, and decided that if she wanted a view, he was going to give her one she'd never forget. The next morning, he woke to the sound of footsteps on gravel, slow, deliberate, entitled. When he opened the door, 2 HOA compliance officers were standing on his lawn, clipboards in hand, acting like federal agents examining a crime scene. One pointed at the now exposed window and scribbled something. The other measured the stump height of the destroyed hedges like they were preparing for court. They didn't greet him, didn't acknowledge him, didn't apologize. Finally, one of them said, "Your property now meets community standards, but the board has concerns about your landscaping neutrality." Landscaping neutrality. The phrase had no meaning until they handed him a fresh violation notice demanding he maintain visibility permanently, which meant he wasn't allowed to regrow the hedges. Not an inch, not a leaf, not a single attempt to undo what they'd done. And the fine for obstruction of communal sightlines would begin in 7 days if he replaced or replanted anything. He stared at the notice, then at the men pretending not to see his rising anger, and felt something inside him settle. Cold, precise, deliberate. Karen passed by moments later, pretending to walk her dog, and offered the fakest sympathetic smile he'd ever seen. "Don't worry," she said sweetly. "Soon everyone will appreciate how open and inviting your home feels." He didn't respond, because suddenly, the idea formed, fully, explosively, in his mind. They wanted openness. They wanted visibility. They wanted a better view. Fine. He'd give them a view they couldn't find, couldn't trim, couldn't touch, couldn't bully out of existence. Something that would make every HOA meeting from now until eternity start with Karen whispering his name like a curse. And as her dog sniffed the destroyed hedge line, he whispered to himself, "You want a view? You're gonna get one. The last one you ever asked for." He spent the rest of the morning pacing his yard, replaying every smug word Karen had ever said, every fake smile, every thin veiled threat wrapped in community standards. The hedge line looked naked, violated, exposed, and something about that triggered a switch inside him he didn't even know he had. He wasn't going to argue. He wasn't going to file appeals. He wasn't going to wait for another neutrality violation. He was going to build something the HOA couldn't trim, couldn't cut, couldn't destroy without violating at least 6 city ordinances and probably 3 federal ones. He opened his laptop, typed 3 words into the search bar, and knew immediately he had found his weapon. Used shipping containers near me. Rusty, heavy, industrial, ugly in a way that radiated defiance. They were legally classified as temporary storage structures, which meant the HOA had almost zero jurisdiction over them unless they blocked emergency access. And his driveway? Wide open, perfectly legal. He called the nearest supplier. "I need 2 40-footers. Delivery today if possible." The man on the phone paused. "For storage? Sure," he said, technically not a lie. By noon, he had spray painted 2 bright orange X marks where he wanted them placed, directly in the line of sight Karen's committee had worked so hard to protect. By 3 p.m., he heard the rumble, Massive diesel engines coming down the street, brakes hissing, neighbors stepping onto porches. Confused, phones raised. Karen emerging from her house like someone had sounded the HOA bat signal. The forklifts lifted the containers over his fence, swinging slowly through the air like metallic middle fingers. Karen rushed forward waving a clipboard. When I asked this, you can't put these here. This violates. He held up a printout of the law, the exact statute, highlighted, bolded, notarized at the UPS store 15 minutes earlier. Her mouth shut mid-sentence. Her dog barked like even it knew she'd lost the round. And when the second container dropped into place with a metallic boom that shook the entire block, he smiled for the first time all week, because suddenly, their better view was gone forever. The neighborhood didn't even have time to absorb what had happened before the panic started rippling through the cold D-sack like a shockwave. Karen retreated to her porch, phone glued to her ear, pacing so hard her heels clicked like an alarm. Within minutes, the rest of the HOA board began arriving one by one. 5 people dressed in beige, moving with the urgency of people who just discovered the sun does not revolve around them. They formed a tight huddle in Karen's driveway, glancing at the shipping containers every few seconds as if they were radioactive. Papers flew, binders opened, and the words, ordinance violation, liability, public safety risk, visual obstruction, and absolute eyesore floated across the street loud enough for him to hear. One board member, a thin man who always looked like he smelled something unpleasant, marched to the containers and slapped a bright yellow notice OFNON compliance on each one. The tape didn't even stick properly to the rust. He stood there pretending to take photos as if documenting his humiliation would somehow undo it. The neighbors watched from their lawns, some horrified, some quietly delighted, all whispering like they were witnessing the first shots fired in a neighborhood war. Karen finally stormed over, rage trembling under her voice. Remove them. Today. Immediately. He didn't even look up from his iced coffee. Show me the rule I violated. She shoved a binder onto his porch table, flipping pages so aggressively they nearly tore. He calmly slid the binder back toward her. No, show me the one that applies to temporary industrial storage structures. The moment she realized she had nothing, no clause, no code, no authority, was visible on her face like a glitch in a robot. Her voice cracked. They blocked the community sightline. He raised an eyebrow. You destroyed my hedges. For a sightline. Now I fixed the problem. She sputtered. He took a slow sip of coffee. Karen snapped photos like a paparazzi at a scandal, sending them to the board group chat so quickly her fingers blurred. Within 10 minutes, an emergency HOA meeting, mandatory attendance, notice was emailed to the entire neighborhood. Subject line: urgent threat to community aesthetics. By evening, the HOA had barricaded themselves in the clubhouse, blinds drawn, silhouettes arguing inside. Neighbors passed by, pressing their ears to the door, trying to hear what level of meltdown was happening. But he already knew. Karen thought she'd trimmed a hedge. Instead, she had awakened a ward, and he had just fired the second shot. The next morning, his phone buzzed nonstop with notifications, emails, HOA blasts, policy updates, all sent within hours as if Karen had spent the entire night rewriting the neighborhood constitution. The HOA rolled out a brand new emergency landscape harmony directive, clearly written at 3 a.m. in a panic, which conveniently banned all unapproved large structures visible from the street. It was so rushed that half the sentences didn't have punctuation, and the PDF still had track changes visible. But the funniest part? The directive required a 30-day public review before enforcement. They hadn't even followed their own rules. Karen, foaming with desperation, ignored that detail completely. By noon, 3 board members marched onto his lawn holding clipboards and wearing matching reflective vests like they were conducting a military raid instead of staring at 2 rusty containers. One of them, the same man who always breathed like he was allergic to fresh air, read from a script. Sir, you are hereby ordered to remove these unauthorized structures within 24 hours or face escalating fines of up to $500 per day. He smiled. Is this the same HOA that cut my legally permitted hedges without notice? Just checking. The man stuttered. That was necessary for pedestrian safety. He pointed at the tiny sidewalk no one used. Interesting. He pulled out his phone and began recording. The board members panicked instantly, shifting, adjusting posture, suddenly choosing their words like they were defusing a bomb. Karen appeared moments later, clutching a stack of printed bylaws, yelling loud enough for the neighbors to hear. She tried to block his camera, which only made her look worse. Their overreaction was golden. Every threat, every contradiction, every lie was now captured in HD, evidence he would eventually weaponize. But the HOA wasn't done humiliating itself. That evening, a bright red violation notice showed up on his door claiming the shipping containers were hazardous material storage units. They weren't. They were empty. And mislabeling property as hazardous without proof? That was legally classified as fraudulent reporting. He printed the HOA's notice, stapled it to a folder already labeled Karen Problems, and added timestamps. Then came the best part. At sunset, he heard shouting near the containers. Two HOA board members were arguing, full volume, because Karen had ordered them to find a code citation that didn't exist. There is no rule about blocking a view. One snapped. Views aren't protected. The other hissed. Karen wants him punished. Make something up. He recorded everything from behind his window. They weren't just fighting him anymore. They were cracking under their own stupidity. And while the HOA scrambled, panicked, and contradicted itself, he calmly gathered evidence, documented everything, and watched the board bury themselves deeper. Karen thought the shipping containers were the retaliation. They were actually the trap. That night, while he sat on his porch sipping coffee and admiring his improvised, rusty skyline, Karen launched her next attack. She blasted an emergency community-wide email claiming the shipping containers were psychologically distressing to neighbors and lowering community morale. She even attached a dramatic stock photo of someone crying beside an abandoned warehouse, as if that was his backyard. It was unhinged, but the real mistake came in paragraph 3. Karen claimed multiple residents had filed complaints, except he knew half his neighbors, and they were livid, not at him, but at the HOA. Within an hour, his phone pinged with messages. Dude, this is hilarious. Karen has lost her mind. Your containers are better than the HOA holiday decorations. She cut your hedges? Without permission? Absolutely not. People were choosing sides. And it wasn't hers. The next morning, 3 neighbors showed up at his door with donuts and lawn chairs. They set up across the street facing the containers like they were attending a tailgate event called Karen versus Common Sense. They laughed, took selfies, and made jokes like, best view in the neighborhood now. The HOA hated it. Karen tried to pressure neighbors into signing a petition to force container removal. Not only did no one sign, several residents recorded her attempting to intimidate them. One neighbor asked, why didn't you send a petition when you butchered HIS Hedges? Karen froze like she'd been unplugged, then stormed off. Momentum shifted. People had lived under Karen's rule for years. Fines for leaving a trash bin out. Fines for unauthorized garden gnomes. Fines for festive lights that were too bright. But now they had a symbol of resistance. 2 rusty shipping containers. By afternoon, a small crowd stood in support of him while Karen patrolled the sidewalk like a dictator whose citizens were slipping away. Someone held up a sign. LETTHEMA and have HIS view. Another. Block Karen. NOTTHESUN. Karen tried one more tactic. She marched up to him with a smug smile and said the HOA would tow the containers away themselves. He simply replied, great, I'll live stream it, and my lawyer will love this footage. She paled. Word spread across the neighborhood. This wasn't a hedge dispute anymore. This was war. And for the first time, the HOA wasn't the bully. They were cornered. Because now it wasn't just him versus Karen. It was him, backed by an entire street that Karen had underestimated for years. And he wasn't done yet. The HOA thought they could outstubborn him, but they had no idea he had been preparing his finishing move. The day after Karen's threats fell flat, he marched into City Hall with a folder so thick it looked like it contained a small phone book. Inside it, photos of the destroyed hedges, timestamps, witness statements, HOA emails, and the contractor's confession that Karen said the owner approved it. He handed everything to the zoning administrator, who raised one eyebrow so high it nearly entered orbit. 2 hours later, The city inspector visited the neighborhood. Clipboards, cameras, official badges. They scanned the containers, measured everything, asked questions, and then delivered the blow Karen never saw coming. The containers were fully legal because the HOA had cut his hedges without permission. He had the right to install temporary visual obstructions while he repaired the damages. Temporary didn't mean small. Temporary didn't mean pretty. Temporary just meant legal. And they were. Karen's face went chalk white when the inspector handed her the compliance report. It was the first time anyone had ever slapped the rulebook in her face, and she had no move left. But the nightmare wasn't over for her yet. When the city sent the official violation letter, it was addressed not to him, but to the HOA, because cutting vegetation on private property without owner consent violated municipal code and came with fines, stacking fines, daily fines, fines large enough that even Karen's Botox poker face couldn't hide the panic. By evening, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. Residents stormed in demanding Karen's resignation, waving screenshots, emails, photos. The crowd wasn't angry. They were volcanic. One man shouted, "If he wants to put a pirate ship in his yard, let him. At least HE pays his dues." Another yelled, "Karen, you are the reason half of us hate living here." Karen tried to blame him. The city, the miscommunication, the contractor, anyone. But it didn't matter. The board voted 5-1 to remove her as president. The lone vote in her favor? Hers. Of course. She left the clubhouse with her box of office supplies while neighbors clapped. And him? He went home, looked at the towering rusty containers framing his yard like battle trophies, and smiled for the first time in weeks. Because this wasn't just a victory. It was a message. You don't get to cut a man's hedges and expect him to fold.